Why are cells cooperating? We as humans are cooperating. We are multi-cell organisms that might one day create a human organism, with us, the individuals, being the individual cells. It is just one hierarchy higher. First, matter created itself in the Big Bang. Then, through entropy, certain accumulations of matter began basically to accumulate even more matter. Atoms are basically matter that kind of organized itself in a way to resist entropy. Atoms then bind chemical bonds, which then make cells. At least historically, apparently, led to cells. Cells then kind of came together. Of course, cells are also still existing on their own, called single-cell organisms. But if cells now come together and form a multi-cell organisms, and there are still a few organisms around, actually many, that are just a few cells. But we are a lot of cells. We also have a lot of single-cell organisms in us that are not us. So there is cells that are us, that are created by us, and then there are cells that are in us, that are not us. So therefore there is a distinction. We are basically the governing entity for all of these single-cell organisms. The question is why? Why are we the governing entity? We are basically written. We are software as well as hardware. We are the software as well as the hardware that emerged out of the Big Bang. And the big conclusion, of course, there could be a lot of other intelligent organisms out there, but as far as we know, we are basically in the top hierarchy of what matter can be. It seems to be that, at least historically, this led to us. Our genes are basically our code that can change over time. We are basically programmed by evolution. Evolution is an external agent that writes our code, but seemingly, at least we have not gained the ability to write our code themselves. So once we are born, our code is fairly static. We don't really evolve apart from the set pathway. So therefore we just follow instructions. There are people like Sam Harris who discuss the free will, who discuss that sometimes 7 seconds before somebody thinks, the conscious part of our mind thinks, the system 2 thinks that one makes a decision. The brain patterns already match a decision 7 days, not 7 days, but 7 seconds before. One could see the hardware as basically matter, as what matter is. Everything around us is matter, and we also exist from matter. We are matter. That doesn't mean we matter. The question is, one of the questions is, first of all, why are cells cooperating? And second of all, why are we cooperating? The fact that we are cooperating and the fact that this leads to basically a Pareto efficient, more optimal, therefore, solution. A Pareto efficient allocation of resources, you could also call it, leads to the question, what happens on the cell level? What happened on the cell level billions of years ago when first cells, it's not billions of years ago. So there are estimates about 3.5 or 3.7 billion years ago that life emerged basically out of chemical bonds. There have been several experiments, some of which have not been able to be replicated. But apart from the question why life itself basically began to create itself, the next question would be why then these single cells would emerge into something bigger. The obvious answer is evolution, but evolution is not really existing. It is just a term we use in order to give agency to basically a non-existent agent that is basically nature. But nature is also only nature if it's on Earth. So we think of nature as this thing that are trees outside, and maybe the air is also the nature. But actually nature is just things existing themselves. So if we take things existing themselves and they eventually lead to basically a resistance to entropy, you could also say, because otherwise, if entropy didn't exist, if there wouldn't be these random things that happened that led to these other random things that happened that then led to some cells being more being able basically to produce more offspring in terms of the cells splitting themselves into half and copying their DNA. And if we then assume that these single cells begin to cooperate in some way, the question is why? Why would they? And the answer is, again, obvious. It's probably that it happened in some way or another, that there was a slight deviation from these cells living on their own, which led to a better outcome, which led to these cells replicating more. So therefore the question, if we take this as an analogy and apply it to humans, would be that we just kind of figured out along the way that if we work with each other, if we cooperate with each other, which often is called, at least in biology, altruism, then altruism is the thing that drives us forward. Altruism that gives us basically the most utility out of the actions we do on a given day, on a given unit of time. So therefore, the value exchange, it is kind of what drives us. It benefits the individual, but it also benefits the larger body of the human society, which now leads to the question, what is the next stage? What is the next stage? If matter created life, then we have the single-cell organisms, and you could also already begin before. You could also already call the different stages of life that existed before, not the different stages of life. You could call the different stages of matter, the different hierarchies of matter. So you take quarks, up and down quarks, then somewhere along this line of going up this hierarchy, you then have protons, neutrons, you then have the nuclei, so basically the nucleus of an atom. Then you have the atom itself. This atom then again forms chemical bonds, which some way or another in some configuration thrown into basically a soup that is made from volcanoes on Earth, at least it seems that way. And then it leads to single-cell organisms, which are basically structures of matter. It is a structure of matter that kind of organizes itself and saves itself against entropy. And then along these lines, code was created. Code basically as a way to program these entities, to program these single-cell organisms in order to allow for development, allow for evolution. So the timescale of evolution, the timescale of writing code, if you want to call the evolution code, and therefore basically the code itself, the DNA, if we call it DNA code, and I think it would be fairly reasonable to do this, since there are many analogies in between those two, or many similarities between those two, and therefore we can draw the analogy. If we then assume that this code is the thing that actually is kind of in the backend that drives evolution, it's not that the code drives evolution, it's rather that evolution drove things to generate this kind of code. And then what results this in, or what this results in, is that every single lifespan is basically another switch. So another opportunity for change, another opportunity to basically update this code. So the updating process is that the single-cell organisms, or also the multi-cell organisms, replicate themselves in some way or another and create basically new versions that then have different code. And then again, you let all these different versions compete against each other, and whoever has the most offspring is able to generate the general gene pool, basically the pool of all the different code, of all the different genes of the individuals. And I cannot finish the previous sentence. If then this pool exists and some of these individuals manage to have basically better chances of survival due to the chances that they just randomly got a different kind of code, a different set of genes, then these tend to outperform over time in the gene pool, and therefore the gene pool changes. Now, the question, why do cells cooperate? If we think of bacteria as a single cell, and then bacteria basically maybe got merged together by evolution into bigger cells, not bigger cells, but bigger organisms that existed, that are basically multiple bacteria that then specialized in some way, and then are not bacteria but organelles. So if this is the process that happened before, if along these lines before life was created, but life is actually, the inception of life is actually just not that big of a thing if you think about it. It is just the organization of matter in some way or another. It is just that now things are kind of moving on their own. So the question what life actually is maybe not that easy to define, I think. It's not that the question is easy to define, it's just that the answer is so weird. So if we then are just basically matter that exists in some configuration with the code that only allows us to write software, basically. The software is not written by us. We are not the software. We are still hardware that is just following instructions. We are basically robots that follow the instructions in our DNA. There might be some argument to be made that we think we are conscious, or we are actually conscious. Whether we are or not, it doesn't really matter. It is just that we use language in order to find some way of basically describing what we think and what we think that we are. So whether we are conscious or not conscious is actually, in the grand scheme of things, totally irrelevant. Whether a bacteria thinks it is intelligent or not intelligent, or conscious or unconscious, doesn't really matter. It's not that I think, it just seems to be that way. And the following question therefore now is, what is the next stage? Some argue it is AI. So we have the single cells. The single cells seem to do better if they combine themselves into a multi-organism. At least it's not that there is a grand outcome. It's just that things happen in some way or another that leaves some bacteria alone or some single cells alone, and others evolve into multi-cell organisms that eventually led to us. So now, if we take us, and the stage before is basically bacteria or single cell organisms, which of course there are different bacteria, some have nuclei, some do not have. Or it's not bacteria, but there are different terms for different single cell organisms. There are also viruses, which are not really considered life, at least to some extent not. They are basically just code, you could say, which uses then an external organism to replicate itself, which is weird, because is it then life, is it not life? So again, back to the question, what drives these cells to cooperate? There seems to be some value exchange. And of course the value exchange again is just a concept we ascribe to the cells. Why do our cells cooperate? Because they are governed by a bigger entity, and this bigger entity is basically our genes. It's not our brain. It's just that our brain is to some extent, or might be seen as to some extent, controlling all the different cells that we are. But it also to some extent provides an environment for other cells to inhabit us. We are basically a lot of bacteria, but also a lot of our own cells. So our own cells are the governing entity for all the different cells that we are, but also for the bacteria. So that there is basically a dumber version of us, you could argue. It is not that our cells are smarter. It is not that bacteria are not that smart. It is not that one or the other provide more value. It is just that both have to exist in order for both to exist. So the question now is, if we assume now that we are the single cells of the next bigger organism, that could be us as one humans. And the question of course is, what drives this exchange of either value or something else? One of the things that is happening, that is apparent, is that the informational flow in between humans is increasing over time. So whereas before you had to have local proximity, so geographical proximity from one human to another in order to talk, for example, or to exchange information via body language. Now, more and more, through the thing we created, through an information exchange system we created that allows us to independently of our location communicate with each other. I talk into my phone or into a camera and you can see it. So basically it's a synchronization of information, it's a synchronization of thoughts. There is also this thought, this idea of memes. Memes are not actually, did actually not originate as memes themselves. It is just that the memes nowadays are kind of a derivative or a deviation from, not a derivative, just a deviation of the original thing. The original thing is something proposed by Richard Dawkins. He wrote a book about genes, basically, and the fact that the genes are actually the agent in evolution. It's not, I think it is also not really the genes, it is just that the genes are one of the driving mechanisms. It isn't basically not us that decide that we want to live longer. It might be now, but it was not in the past. So if an organism has better chances of survival, it is not because the organism wants better chances of survival, but it just happened to be that way. They just happen to have code, i.e. genes that were a little bit better compared to the others. And in a finite pool of resources, which you can see the Earth as, which you can see the solar system as, which you can see one country as, which you can see one forest as, or even one small spot in the sun in the forest where there are very good environmental conditions for the growth of a single plant, which leads us to the single plan. We kind of have a single plan that is our genes. It's not our brain. Our brain is basically just a governing body that is necessary in order to keep this organism alive. There is also an argument to be made that you don't actually at all know what is going on in your body. You basically have been gifted a body, which you can also use to think, but that is mostly completely intuitive to use. If I decided rationally, if I had the power to rationally override hunger, for example, to rationally override me having to sleep, then I probably would stay awake for, I don't know, a week. But I don't, because my body forces me to sleep. So for this reason, there is also an argument to be made that the one who is in control is actually not we, System 2, as proposed by Daniel Kahneman or Kahneman, as the system that is, first of all, that is the rational part of our mind, the slow thinking part of our mind, the one that we can control, or that we think that we can control. And the other part is the autonomous part of our mind, basically the rest. Very simplified. So apart from this question of free will and of agency in our own body, and the fact that you just would stay awake for 3 nights straight, probably, if you could, and therefore you would override the rest of what your body actually needs. And therefore your body forces you to shut down at some point. Similar to how Windows forces you to update its update, or to update its software, or to install its update. So single cells are cooperating, bacteria are cooperating with us, because there is a governing entity that provides an environment for these bacteria, but also the rest of our cells is just governed by something else. There is an information that is exchanged, and this information is provided basically. The single cells provide value to the whole organism. They basically have absolutely no idea, probably, what actually needs to be done, if they wouldn't be instructed what needs to be done. If a cell wouldn't know that if insulin basically hits its walls, that it should open up and get in some nutrients. If there was no information exchange that forces the instructions upon the individuals, then the individuals wouldn't be able to create a human. So what is the next stage of evolution then? If we assume again that we are the individuals for the next bigger hierarchy of organization of matter, or organization of life, and as the informational, it just seems so analogous. It seems to be too similar to not be something valuable, that we first have single cells, which then increase their informational inflow, probably in some way or another, forced by evolution into multi-cell organisms. And now we increase our informational inflow. Through evolution, we develop basically tools that allow us to communicate with one and another without basically us being at least geographically very close to each other in speaking distance, for example. We can, so first books, then well, it's basically books, and then the invention of the internet. And now, if we are able to basically connect the internet to our brains, Neuralink, for example, probably will do this in the few next decades or in the upcoming years, depending on how much. So I recently read this on Twitter that someone said, or it was actually a comment. So the timeline for Neuralink, in order to get the devices it actually seems to want to produce, basically computers that connect our brain to the internet, you could say. Then if this happens in the next 10 years, that's just assuming the current technology we have. But if there is something like a very low entry AI already available, and large language models these days are also already able to write code. Maybe the code is not perfect, but code by humans is also not perfect. One could very simplistically argue. Of course there are differences, maybe still, but it just seems that technology these days is advancing at a faster and faster speed. So basically the speed of change is increasing. So therefore the timelines for predictions of when things are going to happen might be shorter, actually, might shorten as technology advances and helps us with developing the next big thing. And now, what is the next big thing? What is the relationship between artificial intelligence and us? It just might be that we are on the verge of creating the next governing entity for us, because we are too dumb. We are still the single cells, we are the bacteria, basically. And we need a governing entity for us, which cannot be us, because we are only single cells. It needs to be something bigger. It needs to be basically the next iteration of what genes are. It is then again code. Code is basically the genes that... Code is the matter that evolved out of matter just randomly existing and figuring itself out in certain ways, and then being able to create mechanisms, to create organisms that would then accumulate matter in some way and collect. It's like they collect basically certain atoms, and they collect certain chemical bonds, and then these certain chemical bonds can make something else. It's not that there is any specific reason behind this. Similar to how the sun doesn't just exist for us to provide value, for us to provide... The sun doesn't exist to provide value for us. The sun didn't evolve its mechanism of making energy, of making heat, of making light just for us. It is just that it already did it anyway for some weird reason. And this might be similar to how we create maybe AI. AI might be just the next thing. It is then also, if we see matter as life, if we see there is basically not that much of a distinction between a single cell organism and the thing that came before and the virus, and matter organizing itself in some way or another, whether this is planet Earth or it is a single cell organism living on planet Earth, that the next stage of evolution is not evolution of life, it is just things existing. So there is no big distinction. It then also kind of means that, similar to the distinction we have in between think of the bacteria. What would the bacteria think of us, the cells, and also our brains? It would think that this is something that is not natural, because natural is being a bacteria. So the single cell organisms would think of this new foreign entity as something that is maybe not natural, but artificial. And therefore the terms are also kind of equivalent. We create something that is not us. We create something that will be completely different from us. That could be artificial intelligence. It probably is artificial intelligence. We are currently, with our capabilities given to us by evolution and by nature, by matter existing, or by the Big Bang as a result of the Big Bang existing, gives us then the ability to write code that then eventually creates itself. Of course, now a big problem of AI in the first stages probably will be, and there are different terms that are used, sometimes it is the singularity. What is the singularity? It's basically the point at which there is no return, the point at which technology basically overreaches our capabilities, you could say. It is just a very big change that cannot be reversed. There are also other singularities, and of course there is also the gravitational singularity, which is the big hole. Not the big hole, but the black hole. So similar to how bacteria would then say, oh yeah, this is completely artificial, this is completely something new, and and still trying to control it somehow. Whereas actually they are controlled by the thing. It's not that they don't want to, because there is a mutual value exchange between those two, and this might also be what happens to us. We will maybe still exist. There might be just a governing entity that basically controls what we do. And this governing entity is basically the brain of the next hierarchy thing, of the next level organism, of the next level matter, of the next level of matter existing. Life is just basically one of the subplots of matter existing, similar to maybe planets are one of the subplots of matter organizing in some way or another. And if you then ask yourself what will happen to artificial intelligence and humans, then we think of as maybe as organic intelligence, as the natural intelligence, and see the new thing as the artificial intelligence, just defined by us. Artificial is just a word we use to ascribe meaning to something that is not existing in nature as nature already is, but more artificial, maybe created by us. So it is created by us, and similar to how single cells have been creating basically multi-cell organism. The multi-cell organisms. The multi-cell organism is somehow created by the single-cell organisms. They are responsible kind of for it. Of course they are not really, because the agency is evolution, is the natural selection. That is also not really agency, because it's just things happening and then things happening again. So the final point here is that artificial intelligence just might be the next governing body, and we are then the single cells. Not the single cells, but we are the single cells of this bigger cell organisms that of course consists out of multi-cell organisms, that is we. And you could think this through upper and upper. So there are already some theories that there are multiple universes. So you could also draw analogies from life and universes. The birth of the universe is basically the inception of the whole universe. Then there are things that create a lot of energy, and this energy could be... Now this is, again, the other thing is more thought through. This is again just an add-on thought. You have certain locations of matter, and we are mostly empty. Everything is mostly empty. In between atoms and electrons there is nothing but space. In between, it is something that already kind of... This analogy of what if the planet system basically is just another atom system. Of course, this stems from the analogy that is often used, that the electrons are flying around their nucleus in a circular fashion, which is actually not really the case, but it's just a model that is very simplified. Nonetheless, what if our planet system is just such a system? What if, I mean, currently we think of the multiverse as the biggest thing that could exist, not in terms of Marvel comics, but in terms of what actually could exist. So, what if the birth of a universe, basically the Big Bang, and there could be multiple Big Bangs, there could be different universes with different physics, for example. What if this is then maybe the next stage? What if within a universe, basically, there exist multiple hierarchies of matter organizing itself? There is the very, very low hierarchy of what CERN is currently figuring out, of the different up and down quarks. Then we have atoms, and atoms are also mostly empty. It is just empty all the way. If you take a look at the different sizes, then you have a needle, the top of a needle in the middle, which represents the nucleus, so the protons and the neutrons. And then you have basically at the size of a stadium, at a football stadium, you have a needle in the middle, and then the size of a football stadium, you have the electrons somewhere flying around in some random fashion. Then you take the atoms, then they make chemical bonds, and then you again have some weird thing where there is mostly space. But in this space, it is basically, there are a few things existing that kind of control this space. And then you go a hierarchy higher, you have organisms. Of course, there could be hierarchies in between, which I skipped. And then you have multi-cell organisms. And then in the future, you might have multi-cell organisms which form an organism, or basically a multi-cell organism. And this organism again might be governed by its own code, written by itself, by evolution, which we also partially co-wrote, but of course we didn't really write, we don't really have agency from, if you accept the argument that we probably don't have that much of free will anyway. And therefore the next stage could be then, what would be here, a body that is maybe planet Earth, basically. We are planet, you could see planet Earth as the next big organism. It is an atom inhabits a certain space. Maybe it's basically a sphere. And in this space, there is mostly empty space. Nevertheless, the atom controls this space in some way or another. Things that come to it are basically kind of bound into it, or have to basically bypass it in some way or another. It also might just flow through this, but in this space. So there is a lot of space out there. It might be expanding, but the thing is that a certain amount of matter is just in this space. And then if you take the next step, then it is similar to us. We are mostly empty, and there are a few atoms, there are a few chemical bonds, there are a few up and down quarks that control basically the space, and therefore we are able to move our hands, and we also can move in space, which is an additional feature we as life probably have. But rocks are also able to move in space. So, but are they able to move in space on their own? Is it their own free will that they move around the sun? Or maybe they think they are self-conscious? Maybe rocks do think they are self-conscious. There is not that much evidence that there is not that much evidence for this argument, but maybe also we think we are self-conscious, and we are only a few hierarchies below the thing that then thinks it is self-conscious. So what if the Earth then is the next big thing? What if there are many planet Earths in a certain universe, and these planet Earths are just, again, one tiny capsule of what matter organization looks like. And if matter organization then looks like one planet Earth, and then we have one planet Earth, the next thing might be the Dyson sphere. So the Dyson sphere then, again, the sun exists. It exists kind of on its own. But if there is, within a certain solar system, let's just say, there is something that is emerging, that is an organization of matter that then wants to control more of the space. And the control of space seems to be kind of one of the general principles along this hierarchy. The higher we go, the more space this certain thing controls. The sun already controls a lot of the space. We are just part of the atoms that are flowing around the sun, because the sun controls us in terms of the rotation of space. So basically, if we then try to control the sun, if we build a Dyson sphere, which is basically a hypothetical, gigantic sphere that is built around the sun and then harnesses the sun's energy for us as civilization, for the human civilization, or for the next thing that might be governed by AI, if we accept this frame, then it is similar to how a virus basically overtakes its host cells. So what if the sun then is basically one mitochondria, I think it is pronounced. Mitochondria are basically, have been previously kind of bacteria, and they are now in us. We kind of captured them, and we are using them in order to provide us with energy. And similar, now planet Earth and its organisms that developed, with us being one of these, then overtake basically these mitochondria that already exist, and they already existed, and they were already inhabiting some space. The sun is already inhabiting some space, but by overtaking this nuclei of the next big thing, the solar system, and harnessing its energy, we basically expand in space. Whether this is still us or the next big thing, the next level hierarchy is then a different scenario all again. And then what are black holes? Why are there multiple galaxies? Why are there multiple solar systems? It is just a level higher and a level higher and a level higher. And the highest level we currently think we know of is the multiverse. Then below that we have the universe. Then below that we have groups of galaxies. So there are groups of galaxies, I think these are called multi or superclusters. Superclusters seems to be the right word for it. And then we go below, we have the galaxies, and then we go below, we have the solar systems, and then we go below, we have the individual items that flow around in a solar system with again, the sun being the governing entity. And similar how the sun is the governing entity for this local space and influences everything around it with gravitation. The next big thing, the galaxy, it seems to be that in many galaxies there are black holes in the middle. Black holes are basically like suns, similar, they again just inhabit a certain space and control whatever is flowing around in that space. And we are also just, my brain just kept thinking for the last hours since yesterday evening. I just don't know why. I couldn't stop this thought really from happening. I didn't really see anything in the real world anymore. I just thought about this. I am here living in an apartment, which is basically there is almost an uncanny similarity. And I wanted to say the word uncanny in a very long time for this specific reason. I live in a single cell, basically. I am a multi-cell organism that thinks it is conscious, that thinks it can bring up thoughts, and I'm just in this cell here. We all live in cells. We all have our tiny houses, we all control some geographical space, some more, some less. Then there are managers. So basically the analogies just seem not endless, but similar to how in our blood and in our body there are certain cells that repair other cells. We have people, cells, multi-cell organisms that repair other people in certain facilities. And then I saw a bus driving by today, and it's like a bus driving by. We often make these analogies that, okay, and then we have a shuffle from glucose in the bloodstream, and we use our world in order to explain the molecular world of our body, the cell world of our body, what is happening in our body. But what if it is just actually the other way around? What if we just use this because it is so similar, obviously, and therefore, but what if it is just the other way around? What if we just are a level higher in terms of hierarchy? We drive around in buses like cells that drive around in the bloodstream, for example, like the macrophages that eat certain things. We have the garbage disposal that gets rid of certain things. We are basically a giant organism already. The one thing that makes us distinct from this giant organism, that is us, is the fact that we think that we think. And maybe our cells also think, that they provide some super good value for the entire organism. It is just that we currently do not have a very good governing entity that aligns the incentives, not the incentives, but that aligns the interest of all the different cells. I guess that my cells don't want to die, but at a certain point in time I die. Why do I die? Because evolution created the current mechanism of which evolution runs on in order to evolve its code, which is basically the hardware as well as the software, you could say. It depends on how you view these two things. But if evolution created this process somehow, then only by overturning the current generation and the current generation being driven to produce the next generation, we can produce the next upgrade. We can produce the next upgrade of code, which of course is not really an upgrade, but it is only an upgrade to a very small marginal amount that is then selected by evolution again, by the process of one competing against the other for constrained resources. And the constrained resources are nothing else than the matter that exists, the water that exists, the space that exists. It doesn't matter in which metric you wanna, in which metric or dimension basically of matter you wanna speak. It is just constrained, and the fact is that there is always kind of a governing entity that controls a certain amount of space. It's just a principle that seemingly applies all throughout the hierarchy of matter. Then we have these cities everywhere. We have roads from city to city, similar to how we have basically roads in us, that is the bloodstream, that are all the different cells. We deliver packages from one to another because people need certain things. People need certain things to survive, but also in order to thrive. So we develop basically connections. We develop more and more connections and speed up our rate of matter exchange, but also informational exchange. And the governing entity that historically evolved, kind of the people who were smarter, probably to some extent, or the people who wanted to govern more, or the people who thought they are better at governing, they took some responsibility and basically organized other people in a certain way. And this could be the church in the past, this could be religion in the past, that organized the culture, or the culture that emerged over time, or the Bible as I've written as code, basically. We have the code that runs in us, but then similar with culture, we are again try to also implement some changes we think of ourselves and we want to preserve for ourselves, because we kind of inherently know that our code will be overturned, that every single human that starts new, born on a different planet without other humans that give him water, for example, or the newborn water, that might not be able to speak because it doesn't know how to speak on its own. The single entity that is the human is basically dumb. If you threw a human today into a monkey society, then the human would probably never come up with anything remarkable. Would it throw a spear? I don't know. Would it be able to do some things that monkeys aren't able to do because it basically is different hardware? Yes, potentially. But it also might not. So the way we developed code is basically by storing information for future generations and making up a way by basically having enough of us being alive to teach the next generation. And there is basically no clean cut, and because there are so many of us, and because our lifetimes basically overlap with the previous but also the next generation, then we can basically share information with the next generation. And the more we increase this sharing of information with the next generation, the more we can basically maybe gain the ability to even write our own code. We can potentially even write our own DNA. But the question is, what can a single human ever do that is very useful? We seemingly only are useful, or at least very useful, if we connect each other. And therefore the next step seems to be the connection. And then what is the next step? And the next step and the next step is then a whole universe, similar to how we are born. There is some code that runs in the background that controls basically code that runs in the background. Does it sound similar to maybe physics? So there are physics that control what this thing does. The universe is born at a certain point in time. And we don't know why it is born, but it just seems that there is a process that provides the universe with some starting energy, and at some point in time maybe a universe also dies. So you could again see a whole universe as an organism. Of course, I'm just using the word organism in order to now describe what I think the universe might be. And if there is a multiverse, if there is a multiverse, are the multiverses then competing one against each other? And the one that might come up with the best, I don't know, code, hardware, organization of matter is then again driven by natural evolution, part of some bigger scheme. How many more levels are they? And I think this is a nice, very big thought, I think. At least for me, a very big thought to think. How many more levels are they there? Are we just basically not even the single cells yet? If you think of how our history evolved, not how our history evolved, but how we evolved, emerged out of our history. What if we just are the level of single cells yet? And there is something similar to humans in the future, to AI in the future. So basically upper and upper levels. And it is also maybe tied to space. So how many levels are there? How many more levels above the universe, above the multiverse, that we just haven't even touched the surface of figuring out.